I'd like to thank the organizers of Breaking Convention for their tireless efforts in putting together this event and extending their generous invitation to me to discuss certain aspects of the DMT experience. I'm delighted to see the attention being given to DMT at this week's meeting. I entitled my presentation and wrote the abstract before learning that the emphasis on today's panel is on the DMT beings. Because of the panel's focus, I will devote most of my time to various models for understanding them. Most of you are familiar with the research on DMT that we performed at the University of New Mexico in the 1990s. Two results of this study were unexpected by both the research volunteers and myself, and led me back to the drawing board to come up with a new model for the DMT effect. One of these findings was the highly interactive and relational nature of the DMT state. Both the research volunteers and I expected that the ultimate DMT experience would result in a merging with the white light ground of being in a formless, content-free, ego-dissolving state of Eastern religious enlightenment. This was because of both of our interests in and practice of Eastern religious meditation practices. Instead, the research subjects found themselves in a very busy world of light, filled with sentience and willful intelligence, and with which the volunteers interacted in a highly fulsome manner. In this non-physical world, one's sense of self was highly maintained, and it was possible to direct one's attention, make decisions, follow the temporal unfolding of the events, and so on. The other finding was how volunteers appraised the reality bases of their experiences. There was near unanimity in the sense that the DMT world felt as real or more real than everyday reality. In addition, it was also nearly unanimous that the volunteers described the DMT effect to be not like a dream, hallucination, or even comparable to other psychedelic drug effects. In developing various models for the objectivity and/or subjectivity of the DMT world, in particular the DMT beings, I have found it useful to place them on a spectrum, one pole of which is the bottom up and the other pole being top down, and this is symbolized or represented in the up arrows and down arrows in the slides that follow. The up arrows indicating bottom up and the downward pointing arrows indicating top down. First slide. The neurotheology model proposes that the contents of the spiritual experience are the subjective correlates of a brain reflex triggered by certain stimuli such as fasting, prayer, meditation, or psychedelic drugs. This is more or less this is your brain on drugs paradigm, what might be called a hard neurotheology model. The brain generates the subjective experience, which is not objectively real. Nevertheless, or built into this model, there are evolutionary advantages proposed, such as altruism and creativity, resulting from the brain being configured in this way. Next slide. The psychoanalytic or depth psychology model also does not posit the objective reality of the beings. Rather, they are symbolic representations of unconscious psychological conflicts, drives, archetypes, movements towards wholeness. They can provide access to psychological healing and growth, especially when approached with the aid of a psychotherapist. Next slide. The spiritual model with which I approached my research was that of Zen Buddhism. This discipline also does not treat the contents of the DMT state as objectively real, but rather are mind-brain detritus being shed on the way towards the formless enlightened state. Some schools within Tibetan Buddhism put more emphasis on these other worlds and appear to me to be a hybrid of bone shamanism overlaid with Buddhist notions. As with shamanism, these spirit beings' energy in Tibetan Buddhism are channeled for various purposes. Next slide. The first of the top-down models is what we might configure through notions increasingly discussed in modern physics. In this model, one might speculate that DMT changes the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex pharmacologically, which then allows us to peer into externally real but normally invisible spectra of physical reality, somewhat akin to an instrument like a microscope or a telescope being able to reveal levels of reality or scales of reality that we normally are unaware of. In this case, the previously invisible contents lie in dark matter or parallel universes. Next slide. Shamanism also posits the external reality of the beings in a parallel, usually invisible universe. In this context, they are seen or conceived of as spirits of nature and are usually invoked for their powers, such as healing, harming, and so on. Next slide. The new model I've developed relies upon the notions of the spiritual world as articulated in the Hebrew Bible and as explicated by the medieval Jewish philosophers such as Maimonides. In particular, the prophetic state is the paradigmatic spiritual experience described in the Hebrew Bible, and the metaphysics developed by the medievalists propose that the observed phenomena are externally real and possess a greater reality valence than normal everyday reality. They propose that the beings are intermediaries between an incomprehensible or imperceptible God and a comprehensible and perceptible universe. I suggest that endogenous DMT, stimulated somehow, may mediate the apprehensive or apprehensible form or content of those intermediaries, in other words, the beings. In this context, the primary function of the beings is to teach, specifically ethical monotheism, the nature and existence of the one God and the Golden Rule. The beings also in the Hebrew Bible have other functions such as healing, guarding, but these are secondary to their communicative role. In summary then, the beings may be thoroughly objective, or they may be sensible representations of either subjective or objective forces or processes. Next slide. As subjective things, the beings might represent our own psychology, in which case their nature would be like that of a dream's contents. At the most superficial level, they may represent residual feelings or thoughts that linger, barely consciously, in the backs of our minds. At a deeper level, they may be symbolic representations of more significant emotional dynamics that have been previously unconscious. For example, a healing being may represent a healthcare provider for whom for whom we have strong feelings that we can't express in everyday life. These psychological notions draw on the implicit assumption of the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. Our apprehension of the beings reflects the workings of our minds. Next slide. As objective things, we might understand the beings as residing in alternative levels of reality, such as dark matter or parallel universes. Modified consciousness resulting from elevated brain levels of DMT, endogenous in non-drug spiritual experience, or exogenous in other settings, allows someone to peer directly into those realms and thus view their contents, including their inhabitants, the beings. One approach to assess the objective nature of the beings would be to develop instruments that would allow us to capture images of what exists in dark matter or parallel universes. By comparing these images to descriptions of the DMT state, we would be able to determine how closely they resemble each other. If they do, we would more confidently posit an external location of the phenomena. Next slide. Finally, the beings may be sensible representations of essentially insensible forces or processes. For example, the beings appear to consist of light. However, this may not be their true nature, but only the visible manifestation of a particular process. For example, a flame visibly represents or expresses the operation of combustion, rather than combustion, the nature of combustion being light itself. Our perceptual apparatus, as it were, can see only what it is capable of seeing. The chemical process of combustion, the oxygenation of various molecules, isn't seen by us. Rather, light and heat are experienced by us. Let's expand the field of the term psychedelic to include how our minds may apprehend forces that are externally, not internally existent. I believe doing so allows us to interpret the beings as representing previously invisible external objects or forces. However, rather than suggesting that the mind generates these images, this idea proposes that the mind affects how we perceive external forces or objects, how they manifest in our minds. We apprehend the beings in a more or less clear manner, depending on the degree of overlay from our own psychology, biology, training, education. If all of these variables are operating at their optimal levels, we apprehend in as unadulterated a manner as possible those external things. The less well-developed those faculties, the more we muddy our observations of those external things with our own internal workings, wishes, hopes, conflicts, ignorance, and so on. That muddying results in our subjective experience being more of a mirror and less of a window. What are the external forces that these beings may represent? They may include healing and illness, strength and weakness, love and hate, evil and good, wisdom and folly. Using the medieval Jewish philosopher's metaphysics, these are what one might consider to be God's intermediaries, the vehicles or agents through which godly influence, efflux, emanation, work in the universe. For example, the angel Raphael may represent healing forces, and Gabriel, the force of strength. These world-affecting forces manifest in comprehensible or apprehensible visual, somatic, emotional, and other modalities using the repertoire our minds possess. This model of the beings adds an additional level of sophistication to the discussion of the objective, externally existent nature of them. That is, they may not be inhabitants of other levels of reality, or even inhabitants residing in other celestial bodies, but rather they may be omnipresent forces that exist outside of ourselves that we observe by means of our subjective consciousness. If this were the case, then our invisible worlds camera, rather than capturing images of localized objects, may capture images of more pervasive forces exerting local effects. On the other hand, our hypothetical instruments might be unable to capture any images of these external forces or objects, discrete, localized, or local representations of omnipresent forces, because perceiving them requires an interaction between them and our minds. In the case of a local manifestation of omnipresent forces, we might say that lifeless machines, or those without a soul or mind, cannot apprehend divine influence. It is simply too subtle to be objectively recorded. This then leads us into the realms of artificial intelligence, which is another matter, or may not be. Next slide. It's never too early to begin thinking about the implications of establishing the reality of the DMT beings. For example, how best to introduce this new fact to the public. How will we gauge the value of what they share with us? In other words, how can we determine whether they are, to paraphrase the biblical figure Joshua, for us or against us? Will we attempt to weaponize them? Will they attempt to weaponize us? These are some of the things that it may not be too early to begin considering along the lines of some of the issues raised in the analogous discussions relating to ETs. Okay, so I'm available for questions or comments at this point. Thank you very much.